I'm standing on the Riqueval Bridge that spans the St Quentin Canal here in northern France. At the end of September 1918, during the last 100 days of the Great War, an astonishing victory was achieved here that is largely forgotten today. The British Army was, by mid-1918, foremost in the effort to defeat the Germans on the Western Front. Since the opening of the final Great Offensive in August 1918, the Germans had been pushed back everywhere, but by the early autumn had fallen back on the seemingly impregnable defences of the Hindenburg line. Here, the fortress was further reinforced by the formidable barrier of the canal itself. The Germans were confident they could halt the Allied advance, and in a bloody standoff, the Allies would be forced to negotiate an armistice. Yet, on the 29th of September, men of the 137th Staffordshire Brigade of the 46th North Midland Division swept across the canal, smashing through the German defences and breaking the Hindenburg line. 6 weeks later, the war was ended and an Allied victory achieved. David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, called the battle here the greatest chapter in our military history. By September 1918, the Great War had been raging for more than 4 years. It had taken a terrible toll on the armies and civilian populations of both sides. It was the bloodiest ever of conflicts. The Western Front, with its hundreds of thousands of casualties suffered by each army in the trenches and the mud, epitomised what had become the utter futility of war. There appeared to be no end, but by the summer of 1918, Germany was in serious trouble. A series of serious defeats for Germany and her allies, and declining morale at home and within her armies, were accompanied by the arrival of American troops on the Western Front, albeit frustratingly slowly, and at the same time a British group of armies at the peak of their game. But the German army was still huge and extremely dangerous, and in withdrawing to the Siegfried-Stellung, which stretched from Arras in the north some 100 miles south to Soissons on the River Aisne, it trusted in its ability to defend from a position that could not be broken.
By July 1918, the Germans had attacked massively, taken huge casualties, inflicted heavy casualties on the Allies as well, of course, and then they carried out what turned out to be their last great offensive. That was the Second Battle of the Marne, which began on the 15th of July, but 3 days later on the 18th, the Allies, under the overall command of General Ferdinand Foch, launched a massive counterattack and succeeded in stopping the Germans in their tracks. So in effect, what Second Marne did was seize the initiative from the Germans. Then it was up to the Allies to start to exercise that initiative, which they did starting at the Battle of Amiens, which began on the 8th of August 1918. And this, of course, was famously described by the German General Ludendorff as the Black Day of the German army. And really from that point onwards, the Germans were always on the back foot. And they were gradually driven back until by September 1918, the Allies were coming up against the Hindenburg line, the major defensive position, and both sides, the Allies and the Germans, knew that that would be the climatic battle of the war. If the Germans held on to the Hindenburg line, the very least they could buy time to see the war into the new year of 1919. If they lost the Hindenburg line, though, that would be it for them.
Well, it was an extraordinary obstacle. I mean, the Hindenburg line in general is a formidable obstacle. But this part of it, I mean, you only have to see the photographs and it's scary. So you've got a steep-sided canal, which is faced with brick at the bottom. Both sides of the canal are heavily wired. You've got machine guns firing in enfilade down the length of the canal. You have water anywhere between 8 and 15 feet deep in the northern part of the canal. There's less water at the southern end of the canal, but you've got mud. And before you get to the canal, you have to fight your way through the German positions on the west side of the canal, which is at least 3 lines of defensive, heavily barbed wire, full of machine gun positions, and so on. And then you've got to get, once you've got down into the canal and cross the canal, either the water or the mud, you've got to get up the other side and get out the other side if you're going to do real damage to the German positions.
Between Bel-Inglis and McNeil Fosse were 2 more continuous lines of trenches protected by wire, whilst all over the ground to be traversed were sited individual strong points and machine gun emplacements disposed after the principle of defence in depth, much used by the Germans in the last 2 years of the war. Altogether, the defences of the Hindenburg line at this point were as thorough as the science of military engineering, backed by unlimited time and labour, could devise. And the defenders had every reason to believe that no troops in the world could be expected to storm them without colossal losses.
Field Marshal Haig was under no illusion as to the formidable nature of the Hindenburg line, but at the same time recognised it had to be broken. At the start of September 1918, therefore, ambitious plans began to be hatched to carry out the attack. The 46th North Midland Division, spearheaded by the 137th Staffordshire Brigade, would be integral to the whole plan. And why am I interested in this story personally? Well, there are 3 reasons. As a nation, we continue to be wedded to a narrative that emphasises the enormously bloody battles of the Somme and Passchendaele in 1916 and 1917, and the apparent incompetence of British generals. We choose to ignore the successes of the British Army in the field and what was achieved by the ordinary British soldier. We forget that he, Thomas Atkins, and his splendid officers were instrumental in the victory, and a staggering victory it was in 1918. And that of all divisions, the 46th North Midland played the key part in breaking the German defence. This division, considered second-rate after its failure on the Somme in 1916, was chosen and proved its worth for all time.
Although it looks like the Bayeux tapestry, it is not a tapestry, it's actually a painting. It was produced in 1923 by the Simpson family, particularly Major Tom Simpson of the Soho Works in Cobridge, who served with the 5th Battalion North Staffords Regiment, and he, along with some of his employees at the works, were commissioned to actually produce this, so that when the Old Comrades Association actually met on an annual basis, this could be hung in commemoration of those that did not come home. The main body of it actually consists of a series of vignettes of where the 5th Battalion and also the 6th Battalion served, because where one was, so were the others. And it starts in 1915 when the boys actually landed after they'd been training down in Saffron Walden and Luton. They were then shipped across to the Western Front in March 1915, and the wall hanging depicts a series of locations they were at. We know there are 903 names listed of the men who did not come home. We know from our own personal research that we've been undertaking over the last 4 years that in fact we've got currently 965 men who died as men belonging to the 5th Battalion. This is absolutely unique unless somebody can actually prove that they've got something similar to this. For me and for the museum and the people of North Staffordshire, these are the teardrops, and those teardrops of those men are equivalent and important to North Staffordshire, but to the rest of Britain as the Bayeux Tapestry as is to France. And I don't believe there's anything on this scale or anything quite like it anywhere else in the country.
The Territorial Force, as it then was, later the Territorial Army, and prior to that the Volunteers, was very much regional, very much, I think, based on, certainly in Staffordshire, on the big conurbations of the Potteries, the Black Country, and the area around Burton. The battalions who were involved in this particular battle were based around Walsall, Wolverhampton, and Burton, Lichfield, and Tamworth. But by then they would have been much diluted. After probably the horrors of the first day of the Somme, there was more of a policy of not having so many men from one local area. So if a battalion had a disastrous battle, you weren't going to decimate whole streets. And so by this time, the regiments would have quite a lot of Scotsmen, I think. There's a mining background there, but men from all over the country. Again, quite a lot of Yorkshiremen, probably with a mining background. But the thing that was important about them is they still looked for their ethos to those home places that they'd come from. To get an idea of the background of the kind of men who served in the British Army in the First World War, Martin Middlebrook's First Day of the Somme is an ideal book to read. It gives an idea of just how tough those men were. They were working certainly 5.5, very often 6 days a week, in Staffordshire, and many of them would have been involved in mining. Down in the Black Country, they'd been involved in factories, nearly all working in heavy industry, living in very poor conditions, and being paid very little. And perhaps for our generation, who can't understand how they understood the hardship of what went on in the trenches, we should perhaps look back to the lives they were living. And very often they were better fed in the army than they had been actually in civilian life.
Well, the experience of 137 Staffordshire Brigade in breaking the Hindenburg line the 29th of September 1918 was an extraordinary event and an extraordinary achievement. But it was preceded by other extraordinary events of rather less successful in military terms and quite disastrous in human terms. 46th Division was the first pre-war territorial division to go to France as a complete formation. It was really first committed to offensive action at the tail end of the Battle of Loos, an attack on a German strongpoint called the Hohenzollern Redoubt, on the 13th of October 1915. And casualties were bordering on catastrophic right across Staffordshire. It was the worst day of the First World War in terms of casualties in the history of Staffordshire. Not the 1st of July, but the 13th of October 1915. They were also committed again on the 1st of July 1916 to a place called Gomcourt, which was on the northern edge of the Great Somme Offensive, not under 4th Army like the major attack was, but under 3rd Army, under Allenby. It was one of those phrases which chill the blood. I'm thinking of things like black comedy or adult entertainment, diversionary attack. The point of the Gomcourt diversion, which was carried out by the 46th Division and the 56th Division to the south, was to divert German reserves from the south, where General Haig hoped and planned that any breakthrough would take place. This meant that the preparations for the Gomcourt attack were as obvious as could be, and one of the gunner officers of the division, it was later the 6th Earl of Harrowby, told me that it couldn't have been more obvious if they'd stood on the parapet waving the Union flag, his exact words, and saying, "We'll be over in the morning, Fritz." Nevertheless, the attack went in, The 46th Division did really quite badly, worse than the 56th Division. I knew people when I was a boy who took part in the Gommecourt attack, who felt, shouldered a burden of guilt their entire lives for the failure of the Gommecourt attack.
We are in Gommecourt Wood New Cemetery, one of the innumerable British war cemeteries that cover the French landscape. Here lie 748 British and Empire soldiers, the majority of whom were killed on the first day of the Battle of the Somme on the 1st of July 1916. Only 284 of these men have been identified, nearly half being from the 46th North Midland Division. The division was comprised of men from the heart of England, volunteers of the Territorial Force from the counties of Lincolnshire, Leicestershire, Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire and Staffordshire. It had 12 infantry battalions in 3 brigades, the 137th with 4 battalions from the South and North Staffords regiments, the 138th with 4 battalions from the Lincolns and Leicesters, and the 139th with 4 battalions from the Notts and Derby regiment, known as the Sherwood Foresters. These infantrymen and their integral artillery and engineers had been part of Britain's peacetime army of part-time soldiers. The 46th was the first complete territorial division to be deployed to France in March 1915, and while it suffered worse casualties at the Hohenzollern redoubt at Loos in October 1915, it was the attack at Gommecourt that the officers and men regarded as the worst day of their war. We are standing on the right boundary of the division's attack. Across my front, the 1st 6th Battalion, the South Staffords Regiment, with the 1st 6th North Staffords on their left, attacked over 300 yards or so of no man's land against the German salient at Gommecourt village. Their immediate objective was the aptly named Foolery Trench. Hundreds of men were mown down by machine gun fire from the nearby German positions. They never got through the wire, and the division's failure that day greatly damaged its reputation. In the eyes of their corps commander, Lieutenant General Sir Thomas D'Oyley Snow, the men lacked offensive spirit.
If you measure it purely on casualties alone, both at the Battle of Loos, at the Hohenzollern redoubt, and also at Gommecourt, and you recognise that their casualty rate was double the national average, you can see that they were actually thrown in against opposition where they had very little opportunity of succeeding. I don't believe the comment really that they lacked offensive spirit bears any reality to what the men went through on both occasions they were asked to go over the top. And at Gommecourt, it is believed, as far as the 6th and the 5th were concerned, hardly any of the 1,400 men that went over from the 6th and the 5th even actually crossed the 300-400 metres to the German lines. A first-hand account from a chap named Private Thomas Higgins indicates from his own personal observation after he'd been wounded and he was lying in no man's land that he only recognised around about 20 men that were anywhere close to him that had actually crossed that killing ground, basically. And so to say at the end of the day, when you've got a casualty list that reaches into the 1,000, to suggest that they lacked offensive spirit, that's unjustifiable, I'm afraid.
It's remarkable that the division was chosen to carry out one of the most challenging and important attacks of the war, when in September 1918 it was in the forefront of the main attack on the Hindenburg line. But under new leadership after the sacking of General Montague Stuart Wortley, the division began to blossom. We must place this in the context of the whole army learning its business better. But throughout 1917 and the first half of 1918, the 46th Division was well on the path to restoring its reputation and claiming its place in history.
The failure, or perceived failure in some quarters of the Gommecourt attack, resulted in the sacking of the divisional commander, Major General the Honourable E.J. Montague Stewart-Wortley, who was the first general to be sacked on the Somme. His replacement was a highly intelligent gunner called William Thwaites, who was the longest-serving commander of the 46th Division during the war and commanded it almost to the eve of the great attack at Bel-Inglise on the 29th of September 1918. And the division he inherited had a very poor reputation within the BEF. In fact, some people rated it 61st out of 62 divisions when it came to military effectiveness. But Thwaites rebuilt the division's morale, improved its training, and by the time he left the division, I suppose because he got a sort of promotion, he became Director of Military Intelligence at the War Office because he spoke fluent German, 3 weeks before the Great Attack, and then he's moved away. But he left to his successor a division which I think had been transformed from its martyrdom, really, at the Hohenzollern Redoubt and Gommecourt. And in the words of the historian of the 46th Division at Bel-Inglise, Raymond Priestley, he said the division was as hard as nails and ready for anything. And I think that probably well sums it up.
Since the start of what became known as the 100 Days, when the Battle of Amiens was launched on the 8th of August, the British Army had regained all of the ground lost during the Great German Offensive of March 1918. The 46th Division was fighting on its old battleground of late 1915 in French Flanders, when it and its parent 9th Corps were ordered south to the 4th Army to prepare for the attack on the Hindenburg line. By mid-September, the British advance had brought the 4th Army to within just 3,000 yards of the St Quentin Canal and the main German battle zone. The Hindenburg line's formidable reputation preceded it. A soldier from the Leicesters had found a note from Fritz in an abandoned position that had warned, "When we stop, we shall stop, and stop you in a manner you won't appreciate." General Erich Ludendorff, the German commander-in-chief, ordered his armies to show that any further attacks on the Hindenburg line will be utterly broken. The line is an impregnable rampart. But the British had excellent intelligence, and, moreover, by the time the 4th Army's attack was initiated on the 29th of September, preliminary operations had ensured that the British front line had for some days overlooked the entire German defensive system to the west of the canal and a good deal of it to the east. From this vantage point above the canal, the Staffordshire Territorials, who would lead the attack, could see the enemy below. One soldier said it appeared to them that they could throw a cricket ball into the enemy's positions, and they were able to watch the Germans' every move. The detailed knowledge of the German defences was to prove invaluable for the artillery barrage that would precede and accompany the attack. A barrage that was to see the biggest concentration of artillery on the Western Front in the entire war. Detailed planning for the grand offensive had begun in early September. The Allies would attack everywhere along the front in 4 huge operations, beginning on the 26th with the French and the Americans in the Argonne. Field Marshal Haig gave General Rawlinson's 4th Army the key task of breaking through the Hindenburg line on the right flank of the entire British Expeditionary Force on the final day, the 29th. Rawlinson assigned his main effort to the Australian Corps, which included 2 American divisions. Their task was to storm the line of the St Quentin Canal where it ran underground in the Bellicourt Tunnel, thus negating any need to confront a water obstacle. To the immediate south of the Australians and Americans, the 9th Corps would attempt to force the canal where it was the most challenging. The North Midlanders of the 46th Division were assigned the role in an operation that was subsidiary to that of the Australian Corps and which, with Gommecourt in 1916 in mind, had the whiff of being a sacrificial stunt in the view of the divisional staff. The word formidable does not do justice to what the division faced. While preliminary operations had secured all of the old German front line, the Bestellung, the division's plan for the 29th of September envisaged breaking through the A-Stellung, the German outpost line west of the canal, then crossing the canal and breaking through the main Hindenburg line. Next, the Hohenriegel, the support line, represented on the divisional plan as the blue line and some 100 to 200 yards to the east of the canal. The division's final line and the Germans' final prepared line was the Hindenburg reserve system, which was the division's final objective and marked as the second green line. Through its breadth and depth, the massive system was protected by vast swathes of barbed wire, often in belts hundreds of feet deep, and countless machine guns in concrete emplacements. And then there was the canal itself. In front of the division, the northern half of the canal ran through a very deep cutting, some 50 feet deep, with banks at a 50-degree angle. The canal bed itself was 35 yards wide, with water up to 10 feet deep, lying at the bottom of brick walls 10 feet high and all protected by wire and machine guns. Success, on the face of it, seemed inconceivable, a sacrificial stunt indeed. How was this going to work? And how were they going to cross the canal?
Attention was given to how they were going to cross the canal, because this was going to be a really difficult tactical problem. And immense amount of ingenuity shown by the Royal Engineers of the division to develop ad hoc bridging materials made out of petrol tins. They developed collapsible boats, which you could assemble in 20 seconds. Well, you could after General Boyd had got them to train. And General Campbell, the commander of the 137 Brigade, they practiced at a moat in the rear lines to make sure this would work. Scaling ladders were used to get up the other side, and some genius, as Priestley put it in his history of the division, had the brilliant idea of getting life belts off the cross-channel ferries, and some 3,000 of them, so that people could cross where it was wet, where it was very deep, the water. I think the men who attacked, once they got to the build-up, I think when they first knew that they were going to attack this obstacle, a sharp intake of breath, thinking this is going to be another Hohenzollern Redoubt and Gommecourt. But the closer they got to the attack, I think the more confident they were. They were confident in General Boyd, they were confident in their artillery preparations, they were confident in the means, these ad hoc and ingenious means they'd been given for crossing the canal.
So by September, it's very clear that the climatic stage of the fighting on the Western Front is about to occur. And what happens at this stage is that Foch, by this stage Marshal Foch, comes up with an idea for what becomes known as his Grand Offensive. And in this, he's, I think, strongly influenced by Douglas Haig. Haig has quite an awkward relationship with Foch, but ultimately it's pretty productive. And between the two of them, they come up with a plan which sees a series of sequential offensives which would take place up and down the line. So the idea is that a particular formation, particular army will attack in one area. That will result in the Germans being forced to commit reserves, and you promptly hit them with attacks somewhere else, and somewhere else, and somewhere else. Foch's catchword for the offensive is everyone into battle. In other words, the whole armies of the Allied forces will be committed sequentially across a period of 4 or 5 days. Now, this starts on the 26th of September with the attack of the Americans and the French down in the Meuse-Argonne sector. What follows then are attacks further north. The climatic attack is carried out by British Fourth Army under General Sir Henry Rawlinson, which attacks on the 29th of September. The only place where there's an obvious avenue for attack is an area where the canal goes through a tunnel in the Bellicourt area. And that's where the Australians and the Americans make their attack. Problem is, because it is so obvious a route of advance, the Germans defend it very heavily, and that makes a really very difficult task for the Australians, who are among the best soldiers on the Western Front, and the much more inexperienced Americans. The upside of that is for Braithwaite's 9th Corps, because they are therefore attacking an area where, frankly, I think the Germans haven't got their eye on the ball. They're looking further north. That means the Germans are not as well prepared as they are for the attack, which occurs further north, and I think is a pretty significant advantage for the 46th Division when it launches its attack.
By this stage, attacks were not taken on piecemeal. They had prepared for it. They were able to cross the canal on rafts and bridges. But the thing that they had to face was the thing they had to face always was machine gun posts. This wasn't just a canal. This was a canal heavily defended and covered by machine guns firing down the whole length of the canal.
On 28th of September 1918, we were resting between two villages that our troops had taken a day or two previously. Now, Major Wensley, our company commander, had us parade outside some old German dugouts, near which we had our transport lines. During my 3 years and 8 months of active service with the 46th Division, I'd never known an officer on the eve of an attack talk to us as our officer did that afternoon. I remember, when he had us parade there, how determined and how grim he looked. He said, "I want to tell you, men, that in the morning our division has the honour to be chosen to attack the enemy on the canal. We must cross it, and I know our GOC has great confidence in us. If we succeed, and succeed we must, our armies will be able to advance along the whole British front." We knew what we were about to attempt, and the Hindenburg line and the canal were considered almost impregnable. We got our iron rations from the quartermaster sergeant, and then waited until it was time to get on with the job.
The 137th Staffordshire Brigade, 2 battalions of South Staffordshires and 1 battalion of North Staffords would spearhead the attack on the 29th September, storm the canal between the Rieckeval Bridge in the north and the village of Bellinglees in the south, some 3,000 yards breadth of German defences. They would have to attack from trenches located just a few metres from here, where the memorial to the 4th Australian Division now stands. They would attack over a distance of 1 mile, but if they succeeded and were able to consolidate their gains on the high ground to the east of the canal, the 2 supporting brigades, the Lincolns and Leicesters of 138 Brigade on the left and the Sherwood Foresters of 139 Brigade on the right, would attack through them to the division's final objective. In selecting the Staffordshire Brigade for this critical task, Major General Boyd had a brigade of tough, pragmatic soldiers led by very capable officers and NCOs. Each of the brigade's 3 battalions averaged no more than 500 fighting men, but they were very confident in their own ability and that of Brigadier General John Campbell, their gallant commander. The 1st 5th South Staffords was very much a Walsall battalion, and the 1st 6th South Staffords very much a Wolverhampton battalion. The 1st 6th North Staffords had recruited in Burton-on-Trent, but had absorbed a good number of men from the Potteries when the 1st 5th North was broken up in January 1918. While their county make-up had been diluted very much by 1918, with conscripts and reinforcements drawn from all over the UK, they proudly retained their territorial character. When it was time to jump off, all 3 battalions would attack side by side. The 6th North Staffords on the left would attack to seize the intact Rieckeval Bridge. The 5th South Staffords would attack in the centre, and the 6th South Staffords would attack on the right to seize the other bridge in Bellinglees. Seizing the bridges and establishing other crossings were vital to success. The men moved into position in the British front line the preceding night, and as 0 hour approached, awaited one of the greatest artillery barrages ever unleashed in the war.
The Germans always said that the British never knew what a barrage was like, as they were never under one of their own. One single gun gave the signal, and then every Allied gun within miles belched. Dante's Inferno was a mere twitter to this. This was the real thing. There were no two ways about it. This was quite definitely fiery, bloody hell. Hell let loose on earth. Hell with a capital H. Hell with the lid off. Heartbreaking, body-rendering, shrieking, blasting hell.
As British shells crashed down and the machine gun barrage opened up, whistles blew and the Staffords climbed out of their trenches and walked forwards to attack the German army. Hidden by the fog and the greatly increasing smoke from the shell fire, the Staffords had 15 minutes to break through the German defences on the west bank. In extremely poor visibility, officers used their compasses to guide their men forward. As the Staffords broke through the German trenches, German artillery caused many casualties, but the Staffords swept on to tackle the canal itself. The 5th South Staffords in the centre had no intact bridges across their 1,000-yard front. Attacking on a frontage of 2 companies, the men, in their life jackets, were compelled to climb down the banks and plunge into the icy water. They waded, swam, or were dragged across the canal, battling underwater wire and machine gunners firing from bunkers on the east side. The fog and smoke helped greatly to disguise the men, and casualties were remarkably light as they crossed, and the Germans did not detect the Walsall men until they were on top of them. Many terror-stricken Germans surrendered or tried to flee. The few who resisted soon regretted their decision. They had reached the blue line, the brigade's immediate objective, and here paused, in accordance with the plan, to reorganise while the British artillery shifted its weight onto the next objective. The 6th South Staffords attacked the line to the south of the 5th, going forward 1 company up on a 500-yard front. The German outpost line was quickly overrun, and the canal was found to be almost dry for the most part, thick mud being the main challenge. Officers led the way across the deep water in the northern part, and rafts made of cork and petrol tins were used to traverse the mud closer to Bellinglees. German defences were again greatly subdued by the artillery, and made the more impotent by the fog. As the Wolverhampton men fought through the murk, the shout of "Are you Staffords?" frequently went up as they sought to identify friend from foe. The history of the regiment tells how the men swarmed over the trenches like locusts, capturing prisoners in shoals. They then advanced to attack the blue line, again on time. Normally this type of defence would have held up the men for hours, but they bravely battled and bayoneted their way through the trench systems. Critically, a flare was fired to signal that the Bellinglees Bridge had been captured intact. In the north, the 6th North Staffords attacked the canal here around the Rickval Bridge. Capturing this bridge was the most important task of the entire brigade, as it would afford an immediate opportunity to get men and guns across the canal quickly so that the momentum of the attack could be maintained. B Company, under the command of Captain Arthur Charlton, a pre-war farmer from Tottenhall, was handed the task of capturing the bridge. It was a highly valued asset for the Germans, who had used this as a vital transport link to supply troops defending their forward positions. A number of Burton men were already across the canal and climbing the east bank when Captain Charlton and 9 soldiers charged forward to seize the west end of the bridge. They were immediately confronted by fierce resistance from a German machine gun position, but protected by Lance Corporal Smith's Lewis gun, the Staffords swept forward with fixed bayonets. Fierce, if swift, hand-to-hand combat ensued, all the Germans being bayoneted in their trench. A German demolition team was spotted attempting to blow the bridge, and if this had succeeded, the entire operation would have been jeopardised. Lance Corporal Openshaw of the Royal Engineers disregarded the threat as he cut the wires and removed the charges, while Charlton's men dispatched the remaining Germans. The bridge, safe and secure, men began to stream across it. Corporal Openshaw was recommended for a Victoria Cross and received the Distinguished Conduct Medal. Captain Charlton was awarded a DSO and Corporal Smith a bar to his DCM. It was a magnificent achievement, and one can feel this in the famous photograph of Brigadier General Campbell addressing the men of the Staffordshire Brigade from the railings on the bridge the following day.
I was one of the leaders that morning. Lieutenant Jones and myself wrote letters to be sent home if we got killed. Nobody expected us to be successful and see another day. To take and break the Hindenburg line at any point seemed an impossible task for any troops. 2,000 yards of the most heavily armed ground, and the canal itself was a formidable task. We knew it was almost certain death and no glory. But we had very few casualties and everything went to plan. The only attack in the First World War when everything went right, and those letters were never posted.
Within 2.5 hours, almost exactly in accordance with the timetable, the Staffords had reached their first objective. They had breached the German defences and consolidated here on the Blue Line. They reorganised as much as they could, leapfrogging companies to attack again behind the barrage as it advanced through the brigade's final objective of the Brown Line. Already the two following brigades were on the move. 3 hours were now given to consolidate the Brown Line and provide sufficient time to pass the men from Lincolnshire, Leicestershire, Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire forward and through the Staffords to continue the attack. By early afternoon, the division had attained all of its objectives and the 32nd Division was already across the canal bridges. At 5:30 p.m, just over 12 hours after 0 hour, the 32nd Division passed through the front line in pursuit of a retreating enemy. There were thousands of German prisoners streaming westwards.
If I were to say, and justifiably in my opinion to say, that the North Staffordshire Territorial Force that day actually not quite won the war, but certainly brought it to a conclusion. For the Germans by that time were already seeking an armistice, and they knew that if they could hold out on the Hindenburg line, they could bring the war to an end as a draw. However, by breaking through on that one day, it meant that the game was up for them. They knew full well that once the Hindenburg line had been pierced, it would allow the rest of the British and Allied forces to just simply go through. And consequently, they knew the game was up.
We only need to look at what happens on the 29th of September to point out that the 46th North Midland Division is by no means an elite formation. It's a pretty standard British infantry division. It's not regarded as being, particularly elite like the Australians or the Canadians or anything like that, but that speaks volumes that the average quality of British infantry divisions in 1918 is very, very high. I think what happens on the 29th of September, the breaking of the Hindenburg line by the 46th Division, is really eloquent testimony to what a standard British formation can do in 1918. Yeah. And of course, it's not just about the infantry. Absolutely critical is getting the artillery right. And by this stage of the war, the Royal Artillery is a battle winner, indeed a war winner. In 1918, what they have learned to do is fight as a team. And it's the team that wins the Battle of the Hindenburg Line in September 1918.
The 137 Staffordshire Brigade had a difficult time in the war. First of all, at the Hohenzollern Redoubt at the Battle of Loos in 1915, then in Gommecourt in 1916. But without a doubt, this was their finest moment. They not only showed their own bravery in enormous fashion, but they also made it possible for the attacks which had been started in August to continue, and by breaking the St Quentin Canal and producing the bridges which made it possible for that attack to continue.
People have heard of Agincourt. People have heard of Trafalgar. People have certainly heard of Waterloo. But very few have heard of the great success that was achieved in 1918 by the Staffordshire men. The war have sadly repeated itself 20 years afterwards, and the events at Rickvale Bridge simply faded away to be replaced by World War II. But their legacy, if people wish to find it, is here on this wall hanging, this wonderful painting that belongs not just to Staffordshire, but belongs to everyone in the country.
Foch, the Allied Commander-in-Chief, said or wrote somewhere that this was a blow from which there could be no German recovery, nor was there. So this is absolutely a key moment in the war. And it was achieved not by some sort of previously elite formation of super warriors. It was a group of working class and middle class Englishmen from Middle England, industrial workers, clerks, who'd had a rough time for much of the war, but showed at the end, when they were given proper leadership and proper kit, what they could do with it. And it is a remarkable achievement which deserves not to be forgotten.
The victory of the North Midlanders is remembered on this memorial to the men of the 46th Division here at Bellinglees. It was a fabulous, heroic, unexpected victory. Its effect was even greater because the Australians and the Americans to the north had had a disastrous day. Their eventual success, when their attack recommenced the following day, was possible only because of the success of the 46th North Midland Division. The battle went on and the war went on, but it was in its final weeks, the conditions for victory on the Western Front having been set when the battle-hardened men of the 137th Staffordshire Brigade smashed through the Hindenburg line on the 29th of September. As Captain John Milne of the 4th Leicesters was to record, the Staffordshire Terrier is a fine fighting breed.